A centralized authority will use many tactics to maintain and reinforce its own authority, from monopolizing the legitimate use of violence to controlling the socio-economical movability to keep the majority at the bottom, and even limiting the scope of acceptable thought to control perception, while also giving the illusion of choice so that those at the bottom are submissive and even in support of your power. Violence is used in all of these tactics, and violence itself is involved in all social organization. Here we will go through a few of these tactics used by centralized authority to maintain itself. The monopoly on violence. How centralized powers like the state enforce their monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. A form of legalist narrative is used to justify this monopoly by tying its morality. Essentially, the law is moral no matter how harmful it is to the public, and any who disagree with it are immoral. Patriotism is used to make heroes out of the tools of this monopoly, so you will smile instead of realizing the existential threat they pose to your freedom of autonomy. Cops and military uphold the laws of the state to keep it going. Its supposed protection is to make sure you are submissive to those laws, no matter how cruel or illogical they are. Because a centralized authority like the state or private industry holds a monopoly on what is justifiable action and what isn't, and by extension hold the perception that they hold a monopoly on what is good use of force and what is a bad use of force. Complete control over your autonomy of what is and isn't correct action. For example, cops and military enforced racial segregation until the law said it was okay for them to be against it. The security of the state is beholden to it, not the population itself. Blindly trusting these tools of the state is allowing yourself to put trust into something that can easily turn on you the second the leaders demand it. If a king calls for your head, who do you think is sent to take it? Ultimately, any violence the military and police impose is justified by the state, while any violence imposed on them is not justified, even if it is protecting against their intrusion on your right to self-defense. Unless said centralized authority demands the head of a cop or soldier, which is oftentimes a spectacle put in front of the public to make it seem as though there's a level playing field of justice when really there isn't, the population is made defenseless to these whims of state violence. This is what centralizing the means of defense does. In broad philosophical terms, I pose this question. Is morality tied to legality? If so, the law is moral no matter what they are. If not, then cops in the military can enforce any law no matter how immoral or wicked it is. Manufacturing consent enforces submissive attitudes to centralized powers. By convincing the public they have freedom of choice when the choices are engineered by those same centralized powers, it limits the scope of acceptable opinions and acceptable thought, ultimately limiting the power the public has over the government. For example, you do this by centralizing the electoral process to form an electoral oligarchy that poses as two different parties, but in effect still continues the centralization of wealth to the top and continuing imperialist control. The centralization of wealth equates to power and capitalism, which can be a heavy influence on the media and politics, as wealthy shareholders and lobbyists can have a huge impact on what narratives and policies are pushed. Capitalist democracy isn't democracy, as with the effects of this centralization, effectively creates an oligarchy of aristocrats that constantly pull and push the government and economy of the nation. However, a facade of democracy must be maintained in order to keep the people from revolting, so you must establish what Noam and Herman deemed the propaganda model, 5 filters of structural control used by the media to promote the engineered dichotomy. In the US, this would be between the Democratic Party, which is posed as left-wing, and the Republican Party, which is posed as right-wing. This is to establish an Overton window. Media pushes this particular spectrum of acceptable thought, where liberal is considered the furthest left you can go, and conservative the furthest right. And anything else that's considered further left or further right is considered too radical or unreachable. You have your Fox News and you have your CNN. If you can pose these two as complete opposites by posing a lively debate between them, you can convince the general public that they have a choice between a variety of options. Both these options commit to the same effect. Both liberal and conservative are a part of neoliberal capitalism, pushing the centralization of wealth and power and continuing capitalist imperialism. The prime difference really between them is social matters, one posing as progressive while the other poses as traditional. However, liberalism stops short from going any further left from leaving the center due to far leftist philosophy always being anti-capitalist. Liberals will support progressive policies if capital can benefit from it. Many of the systemic problems they pose against are actually caused by capitalism, so any solution a liberal has will stop short of addressing the system. Instead, it will always be beside it. Instead of systematic change, you will get tokenism. Conservatives don't stop short of far-right philosophies like fascism, since fascism promotes centralization of capital and the centralization of the state running it. It isn't a far cry to assume that fascism is more reachable than anarchism in this established dichotomy, given anarchism is against centralized authorities like the state and capitalism. Arguably, one could make the case that the United States is very fascistic, but has been more successful at it due to neoliberal functions like manufacturing consent that have made the population more submissive to it without realizing. In effect, you create a population that is submissive and even in support of centralized violence. Used by centralized power to control the monetary mobility of its population, privatizing the means of socio-economical movability, to lay the burden of debt more heavily at the bottom than at the top to keep those people at the bottom. For example, privatizing the means of education and health so that if those people try to, for example, educate themselves to lift them out of that position, they are laid with a heavy burden of debt. Or if they hurt themselves, they can also be laid with a heavy burden of debt. Essentially, the bottom majority of the population is given a penalty for trying to heal themselves or raise their monetary position. Another form of debt bondage that has been maintained is wage slavery. I've talked about the suffocation of labor circulation in the past, how people are becoming more reliant on wage labor to survive. And under capitalism, the working class are made wage slaves. Wage slavery is being made dependent on wages to survive. You are being rented out by a person for a period of time, which if you are fired, you risk homelessness and death. You see this as productivity rises and wages continually grow lower. There is a form of international debt bondage, where first world countries will impose debt onto third world countries, essentially extracting those resources from those third world countries to maintain the first world, while keeping the rest of the world poor so that only a few countries can rise to the top. Centralization is enforced through these violent tactics onto the public, to keep them from having any significant amount of political power to threaten that very centralized authority. The reason why any centralized authority goes to all this effort to keep you submissive to it is because that if you were to rise up against it, it would be powerless.
Madison pointed out that the British system would have problems if they transferred it over here, and that is because the United States, they did want to make it, he and the other founding fathers, as they're called, did want to make it a more participatory and democratic society. But he said a democratic society has a serious flaw. The flaw is that in a democratic society, the people can participate. And he said, suppose this were to take place in England. Suppose, for example, in England, that they really allowed people to vote, which they didn't. He said, well, the first thing people would do would be to call for what we nowadays call agrarian reform. That is, they would call for changes in the land laws, which would grant more people access to the highly privatized and centralized land system, and that, land was a crucial part of the economy then. And he says, well, we obviously can't accept that. We don't want to have any system that will allow people to participate and infringe on the rights of private property and wealth. So therefore, we have to be careful not to allow a democratic system in which things really function democratically. We have to design a system in which power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, I'm quoting, the more capable set of men, those who are sympathetic with the rights of property. Okay, they must have the power, and the rest must be dispersed and factionalized in such a way that they don't really interfere with the rights of power. Actually, Madison, who was no fool, recognized that this problem was going to become greater as time went on. As he put it, if I can read my own notes, he said there's going to be an increase in the proportion of the population that labors under all the hardships of life and secretly sighs for a more equal distribution of its blessings. Okay, there's going to be an increase in that, and if those people really have an ability to participate, they're going to do things which will infringe on the right of private power and private property and the wealthy, and therefore we have to design the system so that doesn't happen. And indeed the system was designed so that that wouldn't happen. That was the role of the Senate, was to represent the wealth of the nation, and the role of the separation of powers and so on and so forth.